Welcome to the Productivity Show, a podcast where we believe you can get the important things done without sacrificing your health, family, and things that matter to you. My name is Brooks from Asian Efficiency, where we help people become more productive at work and in life. And in this episode, I am excited to welcome back Chris Bailey, four-time attendee. He's the best-selling author, he's speaker, productivity experimenter, a whole bunch of other things that we will get into. Chris's episodes are always some of our most popular, so it's super great to have you back on, Chris. But I also wanted to have Chris on the podcast because he's also the author of How to Calm Your Mind, Finding Presence and Productivity in Anxious Times. Now, Chris, I think the last time we had you on here, I didn't describe you this way, but we described you this way as the most productive man you'd ever hope to meet. So no pressure there, but I'm digging into what took you from talking about that to talking about finding calm and presence. So with all that, welcome, Chris. How are you? Are you still the most productive man you'd ever hope to meet?
I have no clue if I am. We'll see by the end of this interview. But
That's right.
It is so nice to be on. This is the fourth time.
Yeah, I was surprised too. I went back and looked, and yeah, you were one of our, I think, TPS443. So if you dare, go to the productivityshow.com/35 and check it out. This is episode 443. So it's been a while.
We've come a long way, haven't we?
We have come. Yeah, that's right. We've come a long way together. Yeah. Exactly.
Thank you for having me back on.
Yeah. So we start all of our Productivity Show episodes with our top 3 resources. So these are things that are making us more productive or that we're loving these days. And usually it's Tan or myself that give our top 3 resources. But when we have a guest, we like to put you on the hot seat. So Chris, do you have 3 things that you're loving these days?
I do, good sir. First is freedom. It's my distraction blocker of choice. Despite what you might hear about this whole most productive fella thing, I fall victim to distraction myself constantly, just like every other human being that has a pulse. I have the same biases, same embedded wiring for distraction that other people have. So freedom is my distraction blocker of choice. That's numero uno. Second is FocusMate. FocusMate, have you used FocusMate or are you familiar with it?
I am, yeah, it's great.
Oh, it's so good. Essentially, listeners might be familiar already, but quick overview, FocusMate is an app that pairs you with somebody from around the world who wants to focus on something in that moment, either for 45 or for 55, I think, or for 75 minutes. I think those are the time frames. And you have instant accountability. I use it for working on all the things that I don't want to work on because I find the instant accountability super helpful. And number 3, I'm going to go with something analog, and that is jasmine green tea. I'm a huge green tea fanatic, and after writing a book on calm productivity, it's something that I love so much because we get the benefits from the caffeine. We get the benefits from L-theanine, which dampens the adrenaline response that we usually have to caffeine. So we experience less stress as a result of consuming a caffeinated beverage, but we have a calming effect and a focused effect, and it's the best of both worlds without the caffeine crash after. So green tea, vehicle of choice, FocusMate, accountability thing of choice, and freedom, which is my app of choice today.
Right on. We're going to have links to all of that in the show notes by going to theproductivityshow.com. And Chris, I gave you a little bit of an introduction. I pumped you up a little bit. We're both Canadian, so that is very uncomfortable for both of us. We're usually, we usually don't like pumping ourselves up like that, but I had to do it. But for those who haven't listened to the other 3 episodes you've been on, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, what you've been up to lately, and how things are going.
Yeah, things are going really well, actually. I'm having a blast. I am so lucky and fortunate that I get to be a huge, gigantic nerd for a living and read research articles all day, talk to teachers all day, try to piece together their ideas in a way that brings science down to a practical level. There's a good amount of self-help advice out there, but I like to think of what I create as science help because it allows us to live more in accordance with how we're wired, with the circumstances and conditions of our body and our mind. And so this all started about a decade ago now. I don't know when this mythical episode 35 came out, probably around a decade ago, which is how long I've been exploring this stuff. Around that time, I declined a few full-time job offers right out of university to deeply experiment with all the personal productivity advice that I could, all in an effort, because we all know this. There's a lot of fluff out there. There's a lot of BS advice that isn't really either rooted in science or worth our time because of that. And so it was an endeavor to filter out what works from what doesn't. But after that, I that was bit by the bug at the start of that project, and after that I was basically swallowed by this productivity bug, because I've been obsessed with this idea of that we only have so much time every day, so why not make better use of that time? So since, I guess, episode 35, whenever it was that was published, I published a first book called The Productivity Project, a second book called Hyperfocus, and now a third book called How to Calm Your Mind. They've found a following around the world, which is super exciting for me. I think we're up to 35 languages across the different titles, and just I pinch myself constantly.
You're welcome on the podcast anytime, but I always like to have you on the podcast after you've written a book, because I think of you as a canary in the productivity coal mine, in the sense that because you are, as you say, a massive geek about this stuff and you're focused right into this stuff, you tend to pick up, I feel anyway, you tend to pick up what the rest of us are struggling with right around the time that struggle is really peaking. And I was thinking about this because I think that somebody who looked at maybe the titles of your books, progression, you got the Productivity Project, like you said, Hyper Focus, they might see this latest book as a departure, right? First of all, this guy tells me how to do more, and then tells me to get hyper focused, and now he wants me to hit the brakes and calm my mind. Do you see it as a departure that way, or is it like a natural progression?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I see it as a natural progression in addition to the previous work, not a substitution for it. I actually think we need productivity advice more now than we ever have a need for it before, because we're busier than ever before. We have more work on our plate, and we have more to do and more to manage. And so we need these productivity strategies, the traditional kind that, I'm going to use the cliche, everybody take a shot, that allows us to work smarter and not harder. Say it with me. But I think there's a second kind of productivity advice that is becoming more in focus for more people right now. And we need the working smarter stuff, but we also need to find ways of cultivating our capacity for productivity in the first place. And in this latest book, How to Calm Your Mind, I will permit myself one plug over the course of this interview for the book, and there it is. But in the book, I talk about all the ways that our productivity is compromised without us even realizing that it is. And because these ways lie often beneath the surface of our awareness, we don't really clue in because it's not as obvious as like managing email a bit better. But yet, one example of kind of a diminished capacity for productivity is anxiety, right? Anxiety is something that is in the air right now. We have this modern world that we have to thrive inside of. And yet, the world is quite anxious right now, is something that we're finding. And anxiety does compromise cognitive performance significantly. Let's say, for example, you had to give talk for 1,000 people in 5 minutes. Good luck focusing on something. If I ask you to multiply 12 by 24 in your head 5 minutes before this talk, it would take you significantly longer to multiply it at that point in time than after going for a walk along the Rideau Canal here in lovely Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, soaking in a hot chocolate on the way, otherwise with a calm mind. If you arrived home and tried to do that same activity, it might take you half the time. And this is the effect that anxiety has on our cognitive performance. But because we are living inside of our own mind, we don't have the metacognition, the awareness, the capacity for the awareness to realize that our mental capacity has changed because we're a fish in water. We're living inside of this kind of phenomenon. And what we see is anxiety is exactly like that, except before it's the talk, it's all day long we're feeling anxious and our productivity is capped unnecessarily. Burnout is a similar phenomenon where we have more stress than we've ever faced before. And burnout absolutely obliterates our productivity. And it's not a one or none kind of phenomenon. It's very much a spectrum where the spectrum goes from engaged on one side to burnt out on the other. And the thing that determines where we are on this spectrum is how much chronic stress we face, especially from our work, because burnout is traditionally defined as an occupational phenomenon. And when you go from these phenomenons of burnout, of anxiety, of over-reliance on mental stimulation and addiction to mental stimulation, list goes on. Chronic stress, always craving more, over-investing in accomplishment, not realizing there's other values that we can feed from this pursuit of productivity. I think the trend it's twofold. It's seeing the fact that we need a greater capacity, and it's realizing that productivity is about accomplishment, about reaching milestones, but it can be about other things too. It can be about becoming happier. It can be about doing work that we find meaningful. It can be about finding the work that fires us up. And so I don't want to use the word holistic productivity because that sounds corny to me, but it's more of a thoughtful productivity, I'd say.
I like that, thoughtful productivity. You mentioned burnout. This is something I've always wondered. How do you know when you are burned out versus just really busy or really tired? Like, what is there a point where you're passing burnout, or is it just if you think you have burnout, you have it? How do you know?
Yeah, it's really difficult to understand if we have burnout, but there's a lot of fascinating science behind it. There is a test that we can do that has been validated countless times in research. I think it's published in over 50 languages at the time that we're talking right now. And it's called the Maslach Burnout Inventory, and it's created by Christina Maslach. And it's the most commonly used and validated method for diagnosing burnout across different dimensions. There's a healthcare test, a general test. It costs about $20 to do, but it's a good $20 because you can put your finger on the pulse of how close you are to being burnt out. But I think it starts from a place of understanding even what burnout is, because it's not really something that we understand, or at least that I understood at the beginning of my own journey from burnout and from anxiety. So burnout, we think of burnout as being similar to exhaustion, right? And people use the words colloquially very similarly. So instead of saying, I'm so exhausted after this week, people will say, oh, I'm feeling a bit burnt out after this week. I might just stay home tonight. But what burnout actually is, it has three main components. The first, indeed, is exhaustion. We need to feel that state of just total depletion. But we need two other factors to be true about our situation as well. The second thing that we need to feel is cynical. So we need to feel this negativity behind what we do. And indeed, there's a lot of cynicism in the air right now, too, alongside the anxiety and exhaustion. And this is my theory for why, is because it's a core attribute of what it means on a technical level to be burnt out. And the third attribute is feeling just profoundly unproductive. It's feeling a sense of deep inefficacy that no matter what we do, it doesn't serve to make a contribution or a difference. And we need all three to be burnt out. So again, burnout exists on a spectrum. It's not a 1 or 0 phenomenon. And these three feelings can serve as stepping stones to a full-blown burnout phenomenon. And so if you're feeling exhausted and cynical but not unproductive, you might be most of the way to burnout, but not all of the way there. But what that means is, because the opposite of burnout is engagement, you're going to be significantly less productive than you would be otherwise. But again, it's the capacity problem. We live inside of our own capacity for productivity, and so we never truly realize what our limits are. And the fascinating thing, though, about burnout as well is it's entirely possible to dissect this phenomenon in our own work and in our own lives. I should say that burnout is traditionally defined as an occupational phenomenon. It's something we experience at work, but of course the lines are blurred, and this advice applies equally to the home context too. But there's essentially 6 variables of our work where, depending on how much chronic stress we experience, so repeated stress we experience from each of the 6 dimensions, we will either be closer to the burnout side of the spectrum or the engagement side of the spectrum. So the first is workload. So the more work we have on our plate, and the more that our workload exceeds our capacity to do it, the more likely we are to be burnt out, less likely we are to be engaged. Second is a lack of control. So the less control we have over when, where, and how we do our things, the more likely we are to burn out. Reward is the third one. So the less fairly we're compensated financially, socially, recognized for our contributions, the less engaged we become, the more likely we are to burn out. Community is another one. We need to feel connected with the people that we work alongside, or else we'll be significantly less engaged. In fact, in engagement research, this is the most kind of critical ingredient of engagement, is feeling a close connection with the people that we work with. Fairness is the 5th factor, so how fairly work is assigned, how fairly we're rewarded. And values is the final factor, which I think is, as it relates to meaning as well, is the most critical factor here too, is when we can manifest what we truly deeply value through our actions, and we notice ourselves acting in accordance with our deeper values. That's the process through which meaning is made. And that's the process through which we get fired up. We become engaged with what we're doing because we feel as our work is more of an extension of who we are on a deep fundamental level. And so these 6 areas are worth tracking over time. So we can either do the inventory or we can track these 6 areas, how well we're doing out of 10. You can keep a simple spreadsheet for workload, lack of control, insufficient reward, community, fairness, and values, and see how you hold up and see your trend lines over time and track these 6 areas, because this will lead you away from burnout and towards engagement.
That Maslach test, I think, is that what it's called? Maslach test?
Yeah, it's called the Maslach Burnout Inventory. Yeah.
Is that something that anybody can take? You mentioned it was $20, or do you have to do it through like a therapist, or how does that work?
Therapists do them. They do them, but you can also just buy it online.
Oh, great. So I'll track down the link to that and put it in the show notes, theproductivityshow.com.
Yeah. I highly recommend it, actually. If you feel some combination of exhausted, cynical, and unproductive, and if you find that you're on a negative trend line in tracking these 6 dimensions, it's a worthwhile test. Yeah.
You mentioned that therapists do work with this type of stuff. I'm not going to ask you personally, but is that something that you have heard is successful? Is if somebody is feeling this stuff, going to talk to a professional about it, or is it something that you think we can just tackle on our own?
Yeah, that's a good question. The book that I wrote, which I won't mention my name because I used up one of my plugs, my one and only plug. The research in the book and the science in the book is really meant for that level of subclinical anxiety that is brought on by the modern world, modern distractions, modern stress, this structure that we live inside of that may or may not be conducive to what we value on a deep level. And so I found that therapy did help me in my own journey to calm. I am not a therapist. Please see one. And if in any way your mind feels like an uncomfortable place to spend time inside of, a therapist can make you aware of blind spots. A therapist can talk you through the various problems that you're facing in your days. And I'm actually a fan of seeing a therapist when things are going incredibly well. After the journey that became this book, I was in a very good place. I felt calm. I didn't feel anxious. I didn't feel like I had any problems to solve. So I saw a therapist, and she made me aware of problems in my life that still had to be solved. No, I'm just kidding. But it's a fascinating way to, if you're a curious person, and anybody listening to the podcast likely is, there may be problems that are either hidden in your blind spot away from your view, or there may be even better improvements that you can be making to your own situation so that things become even better. And so you can understand and dissect the way your mind is wired, the different thought patterns that you have. I am a huge fan of therapy. I am not a therapist myself, but that's definitely a vector of pursuit for especially folks who are finding it difficult to tame their anxiety and think that it might be more clinical than subclinical, though that dividing line is up for somebody who's in a clinical setting to determine.
You mentioned when you were talking about the 6 dimensions for burnout, you mentioned one which was lack of control, which I thought was interesting because I think this is something where, and maybe this is what led you down the road here, I think a lot of productivity advice is a little tough because a lot of it is very best case scenario. You say, hey,
Yeah.
cut off your working hours, block your time, get out of meetings and stuff like that.
Delete
That type
off
of stuff.
your phone.
Yeah, exactly. Don't check your email, which is all really great and really valid advice. But the fact is, a lot of people, and I know you do a lot of speaking to companies and professional organizations and stuff like this, so you probably hear this, don't have a lot of control over their time. I really learned this, especially during COVID, when my wife was working at home. She's an executive and she was working up in our bedroom, and I'd walk in to get something and her Outlook calendar is literally a wall of meetings. There's no time blocking availability there. How do you, first of all, have you heard that from people working in corporate and that type of thing? And how do you have any advice for people trying to at least gain a little bit of control over their life?
Yeah, it's one sec, sorry. Sorry, editor. I've made it far. Yeah, so the lack of control variable I find to be quite fascinating because we all have a different level of autonomy with the work that we do. And the thing that seems to vary the most is whether we do pure knowledge work with our day. So the closer we tend to be to pure knowledge work, the more autonomy we tend to have over what we work on, how we work on it, when we work on it, the methods that we use, the people that we collaborate with, so on and so forth. And there's this autonomy spectrum out there where on one side is the novelist who can write words in the woods for months on end and never talk to a single person. They never have to collaborate with other people. And there are a few dependencies between the work that they do and the work that other people do. And then on the other side of the end is somebody who's in more of an admin assistant role, who doesn't really have much autonomy. All the work is provided to the person, and they're the ones that have to play traffic cop and manage it all. And so I think a key is understanding where we are on that autonomy spectrum. And this is the job of the reader, of the listener, with productivity advice, in my opinion. My whole philosophy is we need to take the advice that works for us and leave the rest. Not all of it will work for us. And that's the beautiful thing, in my opinion, about personal productivity, is we're all wired differently. We all do different work. Some of us have a crammed day in Outlook. Others of us have one meeting in the morning and an entire free day after that. Some people are students who, that's a weird mixed bag of autonomy where there's no autonomy in some aspects, your exam schedule, your class schedule, and then you have all the autonomy in the world to either slack off or get good grades and study hard. And so we really have to take the advice that works for us and leave the rest. But that said, there are ways of almost simulating control, regardless of our level of autonomy. Doing so makes us perceive our work differently. There's, as always with any experience ever, there's the actual experience, and then there's how we relate to the experience. And there's a lot of debate to be had between how much what happens actually matters versus how much how we relate to what happens actually matters. I think it's more 50-50, what happens versus how we respond to the things that do happen. But we can definitely change how we relate to our own situation. So one example that I give is productivity hours. Some of us don't always have a schedule that we can define, but we can usually define a perimeter around the work that we do, so we're not always in this pursuit of productivity, which can be absolutely exhausting. If we try to be productive 100% of the time, everything we do becomes work, something that we have to get done in order to get closer to some accomplishment that we wish to continually make progress towards. And this way of relating to our things differently, defining productivity hours. So saying today I am working from 9 to 5 and plus 1 hour this evening, and defining a perimeter around that disconnecting around that, maybe defining a couple of hours in the evening for work around the house or paperwork in a personal context, but really having those boundaries as a way of simulating control and just relating differently and working within the autonomy that we do have to push on the boundaries of it and try to expand it. I'm a big fan of working within the systems that already exist around us, because then we have a system that we can push and mold and for the collective benefit.
Yeah, what you say about taking what works for you and not worrying about the rest is so true. I thought of this the other day. We've been breaking up some of our podcast episodes and post like everyone else and posting the clips to social media.
Yeah.
And Tan had one on Instagram about the 4-day week, about the 4-day work week, and about how maybe the 40-hour week isn't really realistic anymore, et cetera, et cetera. And the first comment was, what about restaurants? And it's like, okay, sure, you got me there. Restaurants, it's not going to work. And I'm not like laughing at that person. They're 100% right.
Yeah.
Maybe there's something else that would be helpful rather than 4-day work week in that case. Yeah, I'm 100% with you there.
Love it.
Now I guess we've talked a lot about some of the topics in your books, but I'd actually be interested in looping back a little bit. What specifically got you into this subject? Was there some sort of inciting incident, or is it just you saw this is where things were going? Like, how, of all the things in the world of productivity, what was it that kind of made you focus on this stuff?
On Calm?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the original impetus for this book was being on stage and having an anxiety attack on stage.
Oh no. Oh my gosh.
And so I got up on stage one particular day, and not 1,000 people as we were talking about, it was just 100. And I noticed that once I got up on stage, these beads of sweat started to form the back of my neck, and I felt my voice trembling, and it felt as though there were a dozen or so marbles in my mouth, and my heartbeat really started to increase. I felt these feelings of impending doom and realized I was in this fight, flight, or freeze phase or stage on the stage that day. And luckily I'd rehearsed the talk quite a bit so I could make it through it on autopilot mode, and I just blamed it on having the case of a flu on stage, which thankfully people bought because it's less embarrassing than admitting you're feeling anxious on stage. But that event back at the hotel room after, the event was on the main floor of a hotel. And so I went up to the room after and remember just laying down on the queen size bed in there and thinking, I am not in a good place right now, but I need to do whatever I can to introduce more calm into my days. And I have to be honest with you, calm is not something I've ever found attractive enough to pursue. It's not something I've found interesting. It's not something that ever really was driven towards. But when I found it, I found that I never really wanted to let it go. For the meaning benefits, for the productivity benefits alone, it's remarkable, and I can't imagine working without this calm mind. But at the same time, I noticed that this pursuit of productivity can complement calm, but it can also detract from how calm our mind is. When we don't provide boundaries for ourselves around our pursuit of accomplishment, when we're always craving more, that's a recipe for misery. And it's all about a balance between striving for something and savoring the fruits of what we're able to accomplish because of that striving. And I think so often we focus on just more striving because the idea of more is addictive. And I found this in my own work where the more I accomplished, especially as we measure success by traditional measurements, the more I accomplished by those metrics, the more I wanted to accomplish, the more accomplishment I craved. And the more miserable I became, and the more stressed I became, and the less I actually enjoyed the fruits of what I was doing in the first place. And deconstructing that situation, things made zero sense to me. So I went on a hunt to try to find ways of accomplishing more while being kinder to myself and while having a calmer mind that I was more comfortable inside of. And so that original anxiety attack, I have immensely grateful for it today. I am so happy it happened because I never would have questioned the place that productivity deserves to have in my life. And I think this is something we all need to do. Productivity advice is incredible. It's as if in the book I give the example of a butler. If you won like some contest where you get provided with a butler for life who cleans your house, who cooks meals for you, and you don't have to tip them, that's included in the contest. That's a similar benefit to what productivity advice can confer, right? It saves us time. It brings us more focus. Time is the most incredible resource that we gain back by investing in our productivity. But ironically, there comes a point where we pursue productivity too much, where our pursuit of productivity metastasizes at a certain point into a blind pursuit of more, which is a recipe for misery. And so the question becomes, and by the way, as we pursue more, that pursuit pulls us out of being engaged. It provides us with more stress, and so we actually become less productive when we cross this line. And so this is the fascinating thing that we all need to balance, is how do we get all the benefits of productivity while enjoying those benefits of productivity and while optimizing for the benefits and contributions of our work, while taking care of ourselves and making sure we can do this in the long run while building up our capacity for productivity. And so that's just a subject that I'm completely fascinated by now. You mentioned, is this book a departure or a compliment? I see it as like, it's like the first two books came out, those are the strategies. And this book is defining boundaries around that pursuit of productivity and saying this is the place that productivity deserves to have in our life.
Do you think there was something about that one particular speaking incident? Do you think that there was something about that one particular speaking gig that just did you in, or was it an accumulation of things and that just happened to be what tipped it over?
Yeah, it was definitely an accumulation. And I was doing a lot of consulting at the time for corporate events or companies rather, and cut all that out completely from my life, except for the most exciting consulting things, because there are some things that come up that are impossible to say no to. But really observing that situation and the anxiety and the burnout, honestly, which came alongside that anxiety, really stepped back and thought, okay, these 6 factors, how am I doing in them? How overstimulated is my mind right now? Am I connected with what I value? And I realized that the consulting stuff, I make less money now that I don't do consulting. And I'm far happier because that's the work that I get to do makes a bigger contribution now, because I don't have that element of my work that isn't really leveraged in some way where it has scale. And I find my work is more aligned to what I value. And it was definitely an accumulation though at the time.
Yeah, it's such a difficult thing being willing to take less money for more, I guess, more happiness, more calm. And I want to be upfront, not everyone is in a position to do that. No. But if you are in a position to do that, or could do things to make it happen, it definitely can have a big positive impact on your life, even though it's a little bit of short-term pain. But if you're able to do it, it's pretty good.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And yeah, that isn't advice I give in the book. That's just advice that worked in my own kind of situation. But in my opinion, going back to this purpose of productivity advice, I think it really comes down to values. We have... One sec. Sorry, editors. Or are you editing it?
Yeah, it's all good. No worries at all.
Okay, one sec. I'll mute. All right. So we have these 10 basic fundamental human values that determine who we are on a fundamental human level. And the best theory of values that I've found has come from researcher Shalom Schwartz, who essentially boils values down to 10 ones that all other values are a part of. And the more we express our values through our daily actions, the more engaged we become, the more productive we become because things become effortless, and the more meaning we notice in our work and in our life, because we can observe ourselves expressing these values through our actions. So just a quick primer, because I have them in front of me here, just to give them in case somebody doesn't pick up the book. Self-direction is the first one. So that's independent thought and action. Stimulation is the second one. So it's excitement, novelty, challenge in our life. Hedonism is number 3, which is pleasure, sensuous gratification for oneself. Achievement is number 4. And so this is the value that we manifest when we're investing in productivity advice. And this is why productivity advice feels so good, because we can notice ourselves achieving more. Power is the 5th factor. So that's social status, prestige. Security is another one. Safety, harmony. Conformity is number, what are we on?
6, I think.
That's the restraint of actions, inclinations, and impulses that violate social norms. Tradition is another one that a lot of us have. So that's respect, commitments, and acceptance of customs. Benevolence is another. So that's preservation or enhancing other people that we're in contact with. And one of my ones that I hold dear, number 10, is universalism. So that's understanding, protecting welfare of people and nature as well. These 10 values, they all vary depending on our wiring, depending on our culture, depending on our upbringing. They vary. Some are self-focused, some are other-focused, some come from a more conservative vantage point where we want to keep things as they are. Some come from a change vantage point where we want to try to improve upon things as they are. But these are the core of who we are, these 10 basic human values. And in my opinion, this is what productivity advice exists for. We should be able to become truer to who we are on that deeper level. And I think this is failing of the productivity space in a way where there is this assumption embedded in a lot of advice that accomplishment, achievement is the value that matters above all else. And I get why the marketing works around that point, because if somebody's drawn to productivity advice, achievement is likely something that they do value, so that message would resonate. There's more complexity of that to who we are as human beings. And so I think there's this next wave of productivity literature that's coming out right now, where there is a recognition that achievement does matter and we can use productivity for that. And I definitely use Calm for achievement, but it's also a way of expressing these other values through daily actions as well, and that lead to more happiness, more meaning, more connection, and ultimately more, ironically, productivity. The less we overinvest in achievement, often the more we end up achieving.
Yeah, I think there's some people who are drawn to productivity advice because they want to 10x their productivity or whatever. But there's other people who are like, hey man, I just want to be able to go home and spend time with my kids at a reasonable time. I just want to get my head above water. That's what I'm focused on. And I
just want to enjoy my life. And
yeah, exactly.
The fascinating thing is, and I dig through this research as well, the more we want to achieve and the more we have achieved, the less we're able to savor our lives. The less we enjoy everyday experiences. And the wealthier somebody is, the less likely they are to enjoy experiences, right? Poor wealthy people. Oh, they have it so bad. No, I'm just kidding. Screw wealthy people. Wait.
Title for the episode.
Yeah.
Chris Bailey says.
Yeah.
So I think anyone who's listening to this podcast will know the benefits of things like doing less social media, taming notifications, not having your email inbox all day long. Like those are, like you said, those are tactic stuff. And I was talking about those YouTube clips. One of our most popular one is actually a one that Tan made about making your phone grayscale. And that's one of our most popular tips. So people know about this reducing distraction type thing. But I found one of the most interesting parts of your book was you were talking about doing a stimulation fast. And that's not like locking yourself up in a cabin for a month, Love Actually style, with just a typewriter or anything like that. But maybe you could share what your stimulation fast was, you did, and what you learned from it, because it's really interesting.
Yeah, this is, and I completely agree with you. Advice on this subject of we should all tame distractions. It's shared quite often. But the research on mental stimulation. So whenever we tend to something that's novel, novelty is really the problem in the digital world. Novelty is both good and bad. If we look back on our life, we see novel moments as markers in time. We see the memories, the experiences, the challenges, and that's what allows us to mark the passage of time. So novelty has a place, especially with regard to how we perceive time, but it also can speed up time when we tend to too much digital novelty, because in the digital world, pretty much everything is novel, so nothing is novel. We feel like we're in the digital equivalent of like Times Square. The interesting thing behind novelty and mental stimulation. So every time we tend to something that's new and novel, we have a novelty and bias embedded within our brain, whereby for every new and novel thing we focus on, our brain rewards us with a hit of dopamine. And dopamine is another topic where every time you hear it on a podcast, I feel we have to take a shot together. But we see it as a pleasure chemical, but it's really not. It's a chemical that makes us feel as though pleasure is right around the corner. And so what this does is it propels us into further action and further distraction. And so the more stimulated we make our mind, the more stimulated we wish to become. It's like that constant seeking of more. It's a negative cycle in that way. And the curious thing is, the more stimulated our mind becomes, the less likely we are to be able to focus on what we want to accomplish. Because there's two, not to nerd out too much, but I feel I'm amongst my fellow productivity tribe in chatting with you and for the podcast. But there's two essentially brain networks in our brain that are anti-correlated with one another. So when one is activated, the other is not. One is the stimulation network. It's very highly built around dopamine. It's dopaminergic. And the other is our presence network. So the network that we use to focus, to be in the here and now, as they say, just engaged with whatever's in front of us. So the more stimulated we make our mind, the less presence and focus and productivity we're able to find in the moment. And we all see this, the ways that this manifests. Tomorrow morning, you woke up with your phone, and you bounced around between whatever your favorite 5 stable of applications are in bed, scrolled around. You would want to keep at that same level of mental stimulation because of how it self-reinforces. But the following day, you woke up without your phone. You just had a book on your nightstand. You did your best to spend more time in the analog world after you woke up. You didn't tend to too much dopamine. You didn't, especially empty hits of dopamine, because dopamine isn't all bad. You would find that focus would come a lot easier on that particular day. And it's that day we have at the cottage. That cottage feel, or that vacation feel, where our phone's in the other room and we really don't think about it much because we're with people, we're in nature. Our mind is calm. It's so calm that we can become just mesmerized by the way the campfire flames dance at night, or the way the stars look when we look up at the sky. And that's a state we can cultivate where things become effortless, where work becomes effortless, because we don't have this overstimulation state of our mind. And so this is sometimes called dopamine fasting. And I am really not a fan of that phrase, because we can't fast from dopamine. Our body needs dopamine for its basic biological functions. We use dopamine to think logically. What are you going to do? Not think logically over the course of a dopamine? We use dopamine to think creatively as well. And so we can't fast from dopamine, but we can fast from these empty hits of mental stimulation that we engage with for the sake of that novelty, for the sake of the fact that novelty leads to a spike of dopamine in our brain. And so the fast, I conduct one every 3 to 4 months, because I do find that, it's for the same reason I love Freedom so much as an app. I find these distractions have a way of finding their way back into my life. I'm in book promo mode, so I'm resharing stuff on Instagram and Twitter and stuff. And I have never I haven't used Instagram this much in a long time. I'm going to have to do a fast after the book launch. But we all have periods like this, right? So for a period of a month, that's the period that I like to do, that I recommend. Buy the things to weed out. The empty hits of social media, of digital news. Subscribe to a newspaper if you must. Of shows you're binge watching. Anything that is this novelty that stems from the digital world, especially super stimuli that stem from the digital and the analog world. So super stimulus being anything that's highly processed and an exaggerated version of something that we're wired to enjoy, like social media, like the news. And then you identify some things to substitute in for these activities. And the list is endless. For me, I substitute in playing the piano more, I meditate more, I go for more walks along the aforementioned Rideau Canal. I forget if we mentioned that in the pre-show or the actual show. But exercising in nature, spending time with people, any hobby, any activity that you can sub in for these dopaminergic habits. And then you do the experiment. I'd prefer a longer length of time to reset my mind. A month is what I like to personally do, but your mileage may vary. But what probably won't vary are the benefits. You will notice that focus becomes easier. It becomes effortless at that lower stimulation height. And the most productive things that we wish to do usually exist at a lower level of mental stimulation. They're the things that provide us with meaning. They're the things that allow us to contribute. And you'll probably find fewer impulses throughout your day. If you're writing a document or just writing something, you probably won't have the urge to tend to your phone or to refresh email one more time with your mind calm. And so that's a long-winded answer, but stimulation fast is something that I honestly found quite gimmicky before I did it. But now that I have done it, I've now conducted probably 4 or 5 of them at this point. And I will do more.
It's really funny. At the time of recording this, I don't know what's going to happen, but at the time of recording this, I personally tend to probably use Twitter more than I should. I'll just hold my hand up for that. But at the time of recording this, third-party Twitter apps have been cut off. I have no idea if it's intentional or a technical issue or whatever. And
I think I can guess what the issue is.
Yeah, I'm sure it's very intentional. But anyway, But I've never used the stock Twitter app, and this is going on 1 day now, and I've just found myself not bothering with Twitter. And it's only been 1 day, but even I can feel this like little level of calm coming in my life, because there's just enough friction there that I'm just like, I'm not going to bother. And it's just funny how, like you said, how just removing that stimulus just has such a almost immediate productivity effect. So I can imagine, or just a life effect essentially. So I can imagine if you do it for a long time, I can just totally see what that would do.
I challenge you to do one. I really do. And this activity is aversive. I don't know if anybody loves a stimulation fast. I actually do. Actually, I've come to love these. In my first one, I didn't really expect to love it or enjoy it, but it's such a relief when you create the boundaries around these empty hits of stimulation and dopamine. You feel like you can finally let down your shoulders and just do the things that you intend to do. And that's, I think, what true productivity feels like. It's what thoughtful productivity feels like. It's not so bad at measuring how productive we are, where we tend to look at how exhausted we are at the end of the day as a proxy measure for productivity. We look at how busy we were on a particular day as a proxy measure for productivity. But it's really just accomplishment, right? That matters at the end of the day. What's different in our world, in our life, because we lived a day of our life? What did we produce with our time, our attention, and energy? Productivity, in other words. And it's remarkable that on days we accomplish the most, often we don't necessarily feel like we are, because we're just taking care of business. We're on one thing after the other and hopefully enjoying it along the way. I would challenge proxy measures like busyness, like exhaustion, often a distraction too, just the same, where engagement is what matters above all else. And engagement comes often because of calm.
All right, we have talked about the digital stimulation, and so I want to wrap up by opening the floor to you. The court is in session. There's this weird religious war, I feel like, between people who use digital tools and analog tools, and it's like the fancier the notebook, the more niche the fountain pen is, the better. And on the other side, people are like, hey man, I just want everything integrated. I want to be able to think of something and all of a sudden it appears in my task manager. I know you are more an analog fan, so I'm going to open up the floor for you to make the case for analog tools.
I'm a fan of both. I'm a huge fan of both, but we need to, I think, determine the place that each should have in our life. And I would make the case that if you look back at your most meaningful experiences in your life, right? Life, in my opinion, and I don't know if I should get philosophical or anything, but I think we need to make meaning with our life. That's live it to the fullest, as they say. And most of the most meaningful moments of our lives are analog, right? It's when you propose to your spouse. It's when you're eating a delicious burger that's unlike any other burger you've had. It's when you can look somebody in the eyes and tell them that you love them. It's these moments of connection, of pride. And it's not to say that no connection or pride is found in the digital world. I've written quite a bit that I'm proud of in the digital world that is now a product in the analog world, in fact. And the place that I've settled on where each of these should have in my life is the analog world exists to make things meaningful, and the digital world exists to make things efficient. And so if I want to do something efficiently, I'll do it in the digital. I'll write in that world. I'll connect with others in that world because I have to connect with a lot of people through work. But when meaning matters behind something, if I want a connection to be meaningful, I'll make sure to see somebody in the eyes. I'll make sure to spend time with somebody in person. And so I think there's a lot of debate to be had and definite preferences between the two. But if you think of that Venn diagram of sorts, where imagine two circles. One are digital-only activities like brushing our teeth or walking in nature. The other circle are analog, or sorry, let me rephrase that. I've tripped myself up. Where you can imagine two circles. One circle are the analog-only things that we can do, brushing our teeth or taking a walk through nature. The other circle are the digital-only things we can do, like checking email or social media, for example, assuming we don't have somebody print these things off for us. And where these two circles meet in the middle, there's actually a lot of overlap. And we can pick and choose the things we do the analog way versus the digital way. Writing a letter. Some letters that I write, I want to be meaningful. And so I'll break out a pen and paper, not a fountain pen, unfortunately, but a nice pen nonetheless, and write somebody a note. And that makes a difference to them, that it's analog. Planning our day, I want that experience to be sometimes efficient, so I'll do it in the digital world, especially when I have to bounce between devices. Some days I want it to be meaningful. If I'm planning on vacation or something and I want to see a bunch of things in a certain place. So there's a lot that we can do in the middle. And I think deliberately selecting the things that we wish to do in the analog world versus the digital world, and maybe increasing the level of analog things that we do over time, because that allows us to cultivate more of a presence with whatever it is that we're doing and lower that height of stimulation, which makes focus far more effortless. And that deliberate balance between the digital and the analog, something I find very fascinating. And we all have a different balance to strike, but that general rule, when meaning matters, do it analog. When efficiency matters, do it the digital way, is something that I like to follow myself.
When I started my career, I was working for an organization and we didn't have internal email. So if you wanted to send somebody a note, you would write it or type it. This shows how old I am. You'd write it or type it, print it out, give it to the mailroom, and then the mailroom would deliver it and vice versa. And of course, nowadays we laugh like that's so inefficient, but sometimes I wonder if that was really that much worse. You're avoiding the reply alls to 30 people. You're avoiding the CCing 20 people to show how smart you are. You have to give some more thought to what you're writing. It's maybe not the worst thing, even though it seems crazy now.
Yeah, and what we lose in speed, we typically more than make up for in deliberateness. And I think that's the key, is just because your mind is less stimulated doesn't mean that you're going to be less productive. And in fact, usually the opposite is the case.
All right, let's wrap this up. I really appreciate your time. You've been on the podcast a number of times, so you know the deal. We always want our podcast episodes to be actionable and have something that people can take away and do after listening to the episode. So if you wanted somebody to take some sort of action or do something after listening to this, Chris, what would it be?
Oh, there's so much. There's so much. Making that Venn diagram, finding out what exists in the middle for you, by looking at your daily activities, which ones you can do the analog way versus the digital way, finding things to savor, making a savor list, which is a shortcut to presence, finding out how well you're doing in those 6 burnout factors. If you feel you might be close or you want to rank a few of them high, you don't need all of them to be super high in order to be off balance. You just need a few. The Maslach burnout inventory or an expert therapist who can guide you through doing that in a clinical setting is super helpful. Stimulation fasting, I shan't forget, is a really helpful strategy as well. Minding the productivity benefits of calm. I think it's maybe the most underrated ingredient of our productivity right now is calm. And reflecting a little bit on those 10 values, those 10 basic fundamental human values that make up the core of who you are. You don't score a perfect 10 out of 10 on each of them. We all value each one differently, and that's the beautiful thing that makes us human, in my opinion, where we're all different. We all have these different values at our core. Some of us are more similar than others, of course, but understanding who we are and looking at how we're spending our time, our attention, our energy, and over the longer arc of time aligning those ingredients to these values, that's where we find meaning. And so some things to try out.
That's a solid use of shan't there. I like that a lot.
It felt good to say.
All right. Awesome, Chris. I know you said you weren't going to mention your book again, but I will do it for you. We'll have a link to How to Calm Your Mind, Finding Presence and Productivity in Anxious Times. We'll have that at theproductivityshow.com. But if somebody wanted to learn more about you, find out more about you, where's the best place to go online?
Yes, sir. Yeah, I think it's the end, so I will permit myself. How to Calm Your Mind is the book. I am extraordinarily proud of this one, and I hope you consider picking up a copy. Easily the best thing I've ever created. It's whatever format you want. Local bookstore. Support your local bookstore. I want to encourage folks to do that, but it's wherever books are sold. My website is chrisbailey.com. If you want to follow whatever I'm doing there at a given time, it changes. And my podcast is called Time and Attention, that I do with my wife, who's really smarter than I am. So that's where you can find me.
We have something else in common besides being Canadian then.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Chris. Really appreciated this. And thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you next Productive Monday.